There are deaths that close a chapter, and then there are deaths that leave a door permanently ajar, refusing to settle into the stillness that institutions prefer. April 5th, 1994, belongs to the second category. For 30 years, the world was handed a narrative and asked to accept it without inspection. Most people did, but the physical evidence from that greenhouse room above a Seattle garage has never fully cooperated with the story it was supposed to confirm. And in 2026, forensic re-examinations and formal challenges from people who spent decades inside law enforcement have begun to dismantle the architecture of certainty constructed in the rushed days immediately following the discovery. To understand the end, the preceding months must be read as a forensic timeline. The events between November 1993 and April 1994 form a sequence that, examined in order, raises questions the 1994 investigation never adequately addressed. It begins in a New York City television studio on the 18th of November 1993, where a production crew spent the afternoon transforming a stage at the specific instruction of the man who would perform on it. He had been asked what he wanted. He had answered, "Stargazer lilies and black candles." When the producer suggested this resembled a funeral arrangement, the response was unambiguous, exactly like a funeral. The man who gave that instruction was 26 years old. He had 5 months left to live. The performance that followed has been analyzed from nearly every angle in the decades since. What is less frequently examined is what the choice of closing song communicated. The final track was a 19th century song about a man searching for the truth of a woman's betrayal, tracking her through darkness to find out where she had been and what she had concealed. The lyric that closed the performance was about going to a place where the cold wind blows. He held the final note until his voice fractured, then opened his eyes toward the camera. The audience applauded. He said nothing else. 5 months later, the cold wind arrived. What the world saw was a band at the peak of its commercial power. What existed behind that surface was considerably more complicated. By 1994, the machinery surrounding Nirvana had grown into an industrial structure the people inside it could no longer redirect. The label viewed the man at the center not as an artist, but as a primary revenue asset. There were offers on the table, headlining slots at major festivals, contracts worth between $6 and $10 million. He declined. His reason, recorded by those present, was specific. He looked into the audiences Nirvana was drawing and recognized a demographic, the same kind of people who had made his adolescence in Aberdeen a sustained exercise in humiliation. The music had traveled somewhere he had not intended, and the crowd that arrived with it felt like a betrayal of everything it was supposed to mean. But underneath those questions, something more fundamental had been eroding him since before Nevermind existed. The chronic gastric pain that arrived during adolescence and was never successfully diagnosed had become, by the early 1990s, the organizing physical fact of his daily existence. 15 physicians across nearly a decade had been unable to identify its source or provide lasting relief. He described it as a burning sensation in the lower left abdomen, constant and without interruption. By early 1994, there were nights when he was vomiting in dressing rooms before walking onto stages where crowds interpreted his suffering as aesthetic rather than physiological. Heroin silenced the pain in a way that nothing else had managed. He was not using it recreationally. He was using it because it was the only thing that interrupted a decade of undocumented physical agony. By March of 1994, the accumulation had reached a point of structural collapse. The European tour was halted. He traveled to Rome and checked into a hotel on the 1st of March. His wife arrived late and fell asleep shortly after arrival. What happened in the hours that followed became one of the most contested questions surrounding his final weeks. The official account described it as an accidental overdose, prescribed sedatives and alcohol. The physical evidence told a more complicated story. 50 tablets of a powerful pharmaceutical sedative would have begun impairing motor function within minutes of the first several doses. He was in a coma for 20 hours. The management team told the press it was an accident involving too much champagne, a framing that served the brand more than the truth. The weeks that followed produced a sequence of events the 1994 investigation documented but did not adequately interrogate. On the 18th of March, police were called to the Lake Washington Boulevard property. Officers found him calm, His account was that he had locked the door not because he was in crisis, but to get distance from the conflict inside the house. 3 firearms and ammunition were removed from the property. 1 week later, on the 25th of March, an intervention was staged at the same address by management, band members, and his wife. The ultimatums were not gentle. The band would dissolve, the label would terminate the contract, access to his daughter would be removed. He agreed to enter a treatment facility in Los Angeles. He did not appear to interpret this as recovery. He appeared to interpret it as a temporary concession to people who held his life in their hands. At the Exodus Recovery Center in Marina del Rey, the days that followed showed measurable improvement. His daughter visited, he played with her. He engaged with the program more than expected. On April 1st, he was in the outdoor smoking area with another patient when their conversation turned, through dark humor, to a former resident who had escaped by scaling the perimeter wall. At 7:25 that evening, the joke became action. He climbed a 6-foot wall and disappeared into Los Angeles. He flew back to Seattle first class. By coincidence, his seatmate was the bassist from a band the press had long cast as Nirvana's commercial rival. The bassist later described something in him that felt profoundly wrong, a quality of defeat he had not expected to find. In Seattle, he moved without anyone fully tracking him, seen in a park across the water from the house he owned but apparently could not bring himself to enter. His wife, operating from a Los Angeles hotel, had his credit accounts canceled remotely. He was stranded in his own city with limited financial access. A witness encountered him on the night of April 4th and asked if he had come for a birthday gathering. He received a single word before the figure disappeared back into the crowd. That word was no. It was the last word recorded from him by any witness. On April 5th, 1994, he entered the greenhouse above the garage at his Lake Washington Boulevard property and did not leave it alive. On April 8th, an electrician arrived to install security lighting and found him there. The investigation moved quickly. A ruling was issued. The case was classified. But the physical evidence inside that room, examined 30 years later through methodologies that did not exist in 1994, has generated observations the official record cannot accommodate without significant revision. The toxicological finding that has received the most sustained forensic attention is the concentration of heroin metabolite found at autopsy. The level recorded was approximately 3 times beyond what would typically produce fatal respiratory depression in a non-tolerant individual, assessed by independent forensic experts as inconsistent with the coordinated physical activity the official scenario requires to have occurred after injection. A person at that concentration would be experiencing severe impairment of gross motor function. The official account requires him to have injected the substance, returned the equipment neatly to its case, and then operated a heavy-gauge firearm. The forensic argument against this sequence is mechanical. The physics of what that concentration does to voluntary muscle control does not support the behavioral sequence the official record describes. The weapon generated a separate line of forensic concern. When recovered, the surfaces that would logically carry fingerprint evidence from any person who had loaded, positioned, and discharged it were nearly clear. 1 partial impression recovered. This is not consistent with what specialists in firearms evidence would expect. Either the expected evidence was never deposited, which would itself require explanation, or it was removed before police arrived. Additionally, forensic specialists examining the autopsy findings identified cellular damage consistent with prolonged oxygen deprivation rather than instantaneous trauma. This type of deterioration develops over extended oxygen restriction, not from a single acute event. If the physiological evidence suggests the body was already in oxygen-deprived shutdown before the wound was recorded, the sequence of events inside that room becomes something the official account cannot explain. The note found at the scene has been read for 30 years as the definitive statement of his intentions. Forensic examination tells a more complicated story. The body of the note is written in a consistent hand, describing professional disillusionment, a loss of connection to performing, an inability to find in his work what it had once provided. He writes about the difference between his experience on stage and performers who genuinely loved the crowd. He thanks his audience, he signs his name, and then the document continues in a different physical register, letters larger, pressure heavier, style markedly distinct from everything above. The final 4 lines, written in this different hand, introduce for the first time any reference to his family being better positioned without him present. His uncle Gary Cobain has stated publicly that the upper portion reads as a resignation from an industry, not a farewell to a life, and that the document does not read as the unified statement of a single intention at a single moment. There is one additional detail the 1994 investigation documented without pursuing. His credit card showed activity in the period following the estimated time of death. Purchase attempts recorded after the window in which forensic reconstruction places his death. Seattle police in 1994 were aware of these charges. No investigation of them exists in the case file. No one asked who was holding his wallet. 30 years is a long time for a door to stay open. The official record was reviewed in 1994 and again in 2014 without change, but the peer-reviewed forensic analysis published in 2026, the formal challenges from law enforcement veterans with documented access to the case and family members who have gone on record with specific objections to both the physical evidence and the note represent a body of dissent that is no longer dismissible. It is documented, it is credentialed, and it has asked, with increasing precision, questions that have not yet been answered in full. Whatever happened in that greenhouse on April 5th, it happened to someone who had been in profound and unrelenting pain for the better part of his adult life, who had tried to ask for help in ways not always recognized as such, and who had been failed by nearly every system around him before the cold arrived. His daughter Frances Bean has said her father was a sick man rather than a bad one. That may be the most accurate thing said about him in 30 years. What remains unresolved is whether his death was the conclusion of his illness or something imposed upon it from outside. The evidence does not fully support either version without remainder, and that remainder is where the truth is still waiting. If you are struggling with chronic pain, substance dependency, or thoughts of self-harm, support exists and you do not have to face it alone. In Turkey, the Alo Psikiyatri Hati is available at 182. Help is there. Asking for it is not weakness, it is the beginning of something different.